I am totally illiterate. Philosophy is easy. Anyone could do it. Totally illiterate.
The basic argument here is that because textuality has some resistance or alienness to the form of the present, it's harder to archive, and it's essentially harder to archive. Something that you can present in a form that's identical to itself, that is complete, that does not have a future or a past other than its presented existence, is much harder to archive than something that is, right? So, and the ability to verify these sorts of forgettings is there's a certain, so Nietzsche has this statement that a forgetting has ever happened, it remains to be proven. And because once you refer to something forgotten, it's you thereby demonstrate what you're referring to hasn't been forgotten. So the trace and memory is going to be a big deal for the Pharmakon. So we're going to be talking a lot about this word Pharmakon. And one of the meanings of Pharmakon in this context is, Pharmakon is first of all, just Pharmakon is a Greek word. It can mean cure, poison, remedy. It's one of those words that just has quite a lot of contradictory meanings. The key thing, one of the key things at least here, is that in the Phaedrus, which is what Derrida is going to be reading here, writing is a Pharmakon. Okay, and why? Well, one of the reasons, and the most immediate reason, is if you write something down to remember it, you're in fact never going to remember it, because it's like training wheels that you're always going to be dependent on. Why would you ever remember it if you can write it down? So the fact that you're taking notes, or you take notes, actually is a operation of amnesia in a certain way, not an operation of archiving. And so so writing, and what writing is for philosophy, we're going to learn that writing is sign of a sign. So writing is not essentially going to be like ink or like something or marks imprinted on a substrate. Everything is going to end up being marks imprinted on a substrate. What characterizes writing in particular is that it's a sign of a sign. And it's a sign of a sign that's always going to be dangerous for memorialization, but also necessary. And so it's going to turn out that the Eidos needs memory and thus writing, but something about writing threatens it. So I'm going to make sure this is totally present to us here. Okay. It's topical humor. So Pharmakon obviously is where we get our word for pharmacy. And so part of the reason this is Plato's pharmacy is that it's just a general orientation of Derrida that he, except in very rare cases, very rare exceptions, he's always going to be reading the text of someone else and commenting on the text of someone else in a certain way, because nobody actually invents their native language or chooses it. You're always reading writing that has preceded you. Whenever you are thinking about something, instead of pretending you just create it like a god or something, Derrida's reading orientation and the deconstructive orientation is to try to read our inheritance as closely as possible so we can be vigilant about it and not think we're creating something new, when in fact we're just repeating something from the past. So that's just some preview of this memory question. Okay, so here in this context, what Derrida's doing here is, none of this is explicitly about the Phaedrus yet, right? But what we're going to get into and what Derrida's going to make clear is nobody's really figured out what to do with the Phaedrus. Classicists certainly have not figured out what to do with the Phaedrus. Classicists think the Phaedrus is like, when Derrida's writing, they think this, and they still kind of think this today, like they really haven't learned too well from the Derrida reading. But they're like, that's a crappy early dialogue of Plato's. And how do we know it is? Well, he criticizes writing, but he wrote it down. What a doofus, right? I mean, what a silly, silly guy. But Derrida's argument is going to be that by following this thread of the Pharmakon and following this thread of writing, the Phaedrus, which is a very strange dialogue, it's about a bunch of different things. It's about rhetoric, it's about writing, it's about it's about desire, it's about love. is going to be able to be united by this theme and thinking of writing in a way that classicists never really figured out and still haven't figured out, right? And he's going to be implicitly here arguing with the classicists in a number of different ways, right? And we'll get into that a bit. So when he's talking about any, for example, when he's talking about any criticism, so if you ask like a classicist about, say, Heidegger or about Derrida or something on Plato, they'll be like, yeah, it's really interesting, but that's Heidegger on Plato. That's not really Plato. Or that's Derrida on Plato. That's not really Plato. And I was really confused I recently, with a pretty conservative classicist, took a course on the Phaedrus and on the symposium. And her sort of methodological guardrail was, we're not going to read anybody on Plato. We're just going to read Plato. We don't care what anyone says about Plato. We just care about Plato. It's like, well, but then how do we listen to what each other is saying? Because we're all people saying things on Plato. So there's no account. So there's no account from the class position of what their reading gesture is, what their intervention is. And so here Derrida is trying to say, with this embroidery and web, I'll say metaphor in quotes. It's not really a metaphor. It's trying to say, you can't, if you don't add something, if you don't read yourself, as in say something on Plato, you can't read. You can't intervene on the text. So when he says adding here is nothing other than giving to read. But that doesn't mean there's any relativism or any like, well, you can add whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want. It has to stick to the text. You have to be able to sew it on to the text. It has to be, it's very similar to what, in another context, Deleuze says about buggering and reading.